When I opened the envelope and saw the 2 tickets to the Hillcrest Barbecue Festival, I couldn't help but grin. My boss, Mr. Patterson, had tossed them on my desk that morning, saying, "Take the wife, Frank. You deserve a break." He wasn't wrong. After weeks of late nights and early mornings, this seemed like the perfect opportunity to unwind, and I knew Jessica would love it. She had a soft spot for good barbecue, and Hillcrest was known for having the best. "Hey, Jess, guess what?" I called out as I walked into the kitchen, where the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. She looked up from her mug, curiosity sparking in her green eyes. "What's up?" I flashed the tickets in front of her. "We're going to the Hillcrest Barbecue Festival this weekend." Her face lit up with excitement. "Oh my God, Frank, really? That's amazing. I've always wanted to go." Her enthusiasm was contagious, and I felt a rush of satisfaction. It had been a while since I'd seen her this genuinely happy about something. Life had become so routine lately, with both of us caught up in our separate worlds. Work consumed most of my time, and she had her social circles and hobbies. Maybe this trip would help us reconnect. Saturday morning arrived with the sun shining brightly, promising a perfect day for an outdoor festival. We packed the car and hit the road early, eager to beat the crowds. The drive to Hillcrest was pleasant, the countryside rolling by in a blur of greens and yellows. Jessica chatted excitedly about all the food she wanted to try, her voice a steady hum of anticipation. When we finally arrived, the festival was already buzzing with life. Tents and food trucks lined the open field, the scent of smoky meats wafting through the air. Laughter and music mingled in the background as people milled about, sampling ribs, brisket, and all sorts of southern delicacies. "This is incredible," Jessica said, slipping her hand into mine as we walked towards the entrance. I nodded, taking in the scene. It felt good to be out in the open, surrounded by the warmth of the summer sun and the energy of the crowd. Maybe this was exactly what we needed, a break from the monotony, a chance to enjoy each other's company without the usual distractions. We spent the morning wandering from stall to stall, trying everything from spicy sausages to tangy coleslaw. Jessica seemed to be in her element, her laughter bright and carefree. Watching her, I felt a sense of contentment that had been missing for a while. Maybe things were finally starting to turn around. As noon approached, we found ourselves in front of a large tent where a crowd had gathered. A banner overhead read, "Jack Miller's BBQ Masterclass." Jessica's eyes lit up as she tugged on my arm. "Frank, look, it's Jack Miller. He's famous for his ribs. Can we stay and watch?" I chuckled, seeing her excitement. "Sure, why not?" We found a spot near the front as the demonstration began. Jack Miller was everything you'd expect from a BBQ legend. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a rugged charm and a confident smile. He spoke with the ease of someone who knew his craft inside and out, explaining the art of grilling with a passion that was almost infectious. Jessica was completely enthralled, her eyes glued to Jack as he worked his magic on the grill. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, noticing the way she leaned forward slightly, hanging on to his every word. It was just admiration, I told myself. After all, who wouldn't be impressed by a guy like Jack? But as the session went on, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. There was something about the way she looked at him, something I hadn't seen in a long time. After the masterclass, Jack invited the crowd to try some of his freshly grilled ribs. Jessica was quick to join the line, her excitement palpable. I followed her, feeling a little less enthusiastic, but still looking forward to tasting the famous ribs everyone raved about. As we approached the serving table, Jack spotted Jessica in the crowd and flashed her a smile. "You've got a good eye for BBQ," he said, handing her a plate with an extra-large portion. "Hope you enjoy." Jessica blushed slightly, her smile wide and genuine. "Thank you. I'm sure it'll be amazing." I took my plate from another server, trying to ignore the exchange. It was nothing, I told myself, just a friendly interaction. But there was something in the way she looked at him, something that made my chest tighten with unease. We found a small table near the edge of the tent and sat down to eat. The ribs were as good as promised, smoky and tender, with a sauce that was both sweet and tangy. Jessica made a point of savoring each bite, her eyes occasionally drifting back to where Jack was still chatting with other festival-goers. "This is incredible," she said, licking her fingers clean. "We should try to recreate this at home sometime." "Yeah, maybe," I replied, trying to sound more enthusiastic than I felt. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying the interaction between her and Jack. Was I being paranoid? It was just a simple exchange, a moment of harmless flirting, if that. But as we continued our meal, I couldn't help but notice how often her gaze wandered back to him, how her smile lingered just a little too long. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of food and music. We sampled more dishes, listened to a few bands, and even tried our hand at some of the carnival games scattered throughout the festival grounds. But no matter what we did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jessica seemed more distant than usual, her mind clearly elsewhere. And every time we passed by Jack's tent, she would glance in that direction, her expression unreadable. I tried to engage her in conversation, to bring back the lighthearted mood we'd started the day with, but it was like talking to someone with half their attention focused elsewhere. By late afternoon, I was beginning to feel the strain. The festival, which had seemed like such a good idea that morning, now felt like a mistake. Maybe we should have stayed home, spent the day doing something just the two of us. But it was too late for that now. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows over the festival grounds, Jessica turned to me with a strange look in her eyes. "I think I'm going to go check out some of the other stalls," she said casually. "Maybe pick up a few things for the road." I frowned. "Do you want me to come with you?" She shook her head, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "No, it's fine. I'll just be a few minutes. Why don't you relax here for a bit? I'll be right back." Reluctantly, I agreed, watching as she walked off into the crowd. The uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger, but I pushed it aside, telling myself I was overreacting. She just wanted some space, that was all. There was nothing to worry about. But as the minutes ticked by, and then stretched into an hour, I couldn't sit still any longer. I got up and began to wander through the festival, looking for any sign of her. The crowd had thinned out as the day wore on, making it easier to navigate the maze of tents and stalls. I searched everywhere, my concern growing with each passing minute. Where could she have gone? I checked the food stalls, the craft booths, even the bathrooms, but there was no sign of her. Panic began to set in as I made my way back to Jack's tent, hoping against hope that she'd be there, laughing and chatting with other festival goers. But when I arrived, the tent was nearly empty. Jack was still there, packing up his equipment, but Jessica was nowhere in sight. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck as I approached him. "Hey, have you seen my wife?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She said she was coming this way." Jack looked up, his expression unreadable. "I haven't seen her in a while. Maybe she's still looking around." His words did little to calm my nerves. I nodded and forced a smile before turning away, but my mind was racing. Where could she be? And why hadn't she come back yet? I wandered aimlessly through the festival grounds, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of worry and suspicion. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the festival was beginning to wind down. The lively atmosphere of the day had given way to a more subdued, almost melancholic mood as people packed up their things and started heading home. But I wasn't ready to leave. Not without Jessica. As I passed by a row of food trucks, I spotted a small pathway leading to a more secluded area of the festival. It was poorly lit, almost hidden behind a cluster of tents. Something about it caught my attention, a nagging feeling at the back of my mind urging me to check it out. I hesitated for a moment, then turned down the path. The further I walked, the quieter it became. The sounds of the festival faded into the background, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of crickets. It was almost peaceful, if it weren't for the growing sense of dread gnawing at my insides. And then, just ahead, I saw them. Jessica and Jack, standing together beneath a large oak tree. They were close, too close. Her hand rested on his arm, and he was leaning in, his face inches from hers. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, everything frozen in time except for the two of them. I wanted to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the scene unfolding before me. It was like watching a nightmare come to life. I must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath or a step forward, because they both looked up at the same time. Jessica's eyes widened in shock, her hand dropping from Jack's arm as if she'd been burned. "Frank," she started, but her voice trailed off. the words dying on her lips. Jack took a step back, his expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "This isn't what it looks like," he said, though we all knew it was a lie. I felt something snap inside me, a surge of anger so intense it made my vision blur. "Then what the hell is it, Jack?" My voice was low, trembling with barely restrained rage. "What the hell is going on here?" Jessica took a step towards me, her eyes pleading. "Frank, please let me explain." But I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear any of it. The truth was staring me in the face, and it was more than I could bear. I turned and walked away, leaving them both standing there under that damned oak tree. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away, as far away from them as possible. The night air was cool against my skin, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of betrayal and disbelief. How could this have happened? How could she do this to me? As I made my way back to the main festival grounds, the noise and lights felt distant, almost surreal. The world around me seemed to blur, my mind too consumed by what I'd just witnessed to fully process anything else. By the time I reached the car, I was shaking. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing, trying to make sense of the chaos in my head. But there was no making sense of it. There was only pain, raw and unrelenting, tearing through me with every breath. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness. Minutes, hours? It didn't matter. Time had lost all meaning. Eventually, I got into the car and slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the empty parking lot. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my mind racing through 1,000 different thoughts, none of them making any sense. What was I supposed to do now? How could I go back to our life, knowing what I knew? The answer was simple. I couldn't. And as I drove away from the festival, leaving Jessica and Jack and everything I thought I knew behind, one thing became painfully clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't go straight home. I couldn't. The idea of returning to the house I shared with Jessica, our house, filled with memories now tainted, was unbearable. So I drove aimlessly through the night, the roads empty and the sky a blanket of stars that offered no comfort. The radio was off, the silence in the car oppressive. My thoughts, though, were loud, crashing against each other in a chaotic mess. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, Jessica and Jack, standing together, her hand on his arm, the look in her eyes. It was a look I hadn't seen in years, not directed at me at least. How long had this been going on? Had I been so blind, so wrapped up in my own world that I hadn't seen the signs? The thought made my stomach churn with a sickening mix of anger and self-loathing. But more than anything, I felt hollow, as if everything I thought I knew had been ripped away, leaving nothing but an empty shell in its place. Eventually, I found myself parked in a lot overlooking the river. The water was calm, reflecting the moonlight in a way that should have been peaceful, but all I felt was a deep, gnawing pain, a sense of loss that was almost physical in its intensity. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to wrap my head around what had happened, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't stay in that car forever. At some point, I would have to face her, to confront the reality of what had happened. But not yet. I wasn't ready. The thought of seeing her again, of hearing whatever excuses or explanations she might offer, was too much to bear. So I stayed there, watching the river, until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. Only then did I turn the key in the ignition and drive home, dreading what I knew awaited me. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was still dark. For a moment, I considered turning around and leaving, driving until I ran out of gas or found somewhere, anywhere else to be. But I knew I couldn't avoid this forever. So I killed the engine and got out, my legs feeling like lead as I walked up the front steps. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The living room was exactly as we'd left it that morning, the remnants of our breakfast still on the table. It was surreal, how normal everything looked, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I found Jessica in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and puffy from crying. The sight of her so small and vulnerable tugged at something inside me. But it wasn't enough to dispel the anger still simmering beneath the surface. "Frank," she began, her voice hoarse. I held up a hand, cutting her off. I don't want to hear it. Not now." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. And for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then the image of her with Jack flashed in my mind, and the anger flared up again, burning away any trace of pity. I need to know one thing, I said, my voice cold. How long? She hesitated, looking down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. A few months, she whispered. It started after you began working late all the time. I clenched my jaw, the words cutting deeper than I'd expected. I'd known it hadn't been just a one-time thing, but hearing it confirmed made the betrayal all the more real. And you thought that justified this? That because I was working you could just… No, she interrupted, looking up at me with desperation in her eyes. It wasn't like that. I didn't plan this, Frank. It just happened. It just happened, I repeated, bitterness lacing my voice. That's supposed to make it better? No, she admitted, her voice breaking. I know it doesn't. And I'm sorry, Frank. I'm so sorry. But you have to understand. I don't have to understand anything, I snapped, the anger boiling over. You cheated on me, Jessica. You lied to me every day for months. How the hell am I supposed to understand that? She flinched at my words, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our heavy breathing filling the room. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I was lonely, Frank. You were never home, and when you were, it was like you weren't even there. I needed someone, and Jack was there. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Her words hurt because deep down, I knew there was some truth to them. I had been distant, consumed by work, by the pressures of providing for us. But that didn't excuse what she'd done. It didn't make it okay. I thought we were happy, I said, my voice hollow. I thought we were fine. So did I, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But somewhere along the way, we lost each other, Frank. And I didn't know how to find my way back. I wanted to argue, to tell her she should have tried harder, should have talked to me instead of turning to someone else. But the words wouldn't come, because in a way, I knew she was right. We had lost each other, and neither of us had done anything to fix it. But that didn't change the fact that she'd betrayed me, that she'd shattered whatever trust we had left. I need some time, I finally said, my voice cold. I need to figure out what to do next. She nodded, wiping away her tears. I understand. But I wasn't sure if I did. The days that followed were a blur of pain and confusion. I went through the motions of life, going to work, coming home, but everything felt off, like I was living someone else's life. Jessica and I barely spoke, each of us retreating into our own worlds, avoiding the inevitable confrontation that loomed over us. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The festival, the moment I saw them together, the conversation that followed. It was like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, heard their voices, felt the gut-wrenching pain all over again. I couldn't live like this. I knew that much. But the thought of leaving, of ending our marriage, was terrifying. We had been together for so long, nearly 20 years. How could I just walk away from that? How could I throw away everything we'd built together, even if it was in ruins now? But then, I would remember the way she looked at him, the way she confessed to her betrayal, and the anger would return, burning away any lingering doubts. She had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. One evening, after another silent dinner, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront this, had to make a decision, even if it tore me apart. I found Jessica in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book she clearly wasn't reading. Jessica, I said, my voice firm, we need to talk. She looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. She knew what was coming, just as I did, but there was no avoiding it. I've been thinking a lot, I began, sitting down across from her. About us, about what happened. She nodded, not saying anything, just waiting for me to continue. I can't forgive you for what you did, I said, the words heavy with finality. I can't get past it. Every time I look at you, all I see is him. And it kills me, Jessica. It's like a knife in my gut every single time. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. I'm sorry, Frank. I never meant to hurt you. But you did, I said, my voice cold. And I don't think I can ever forget that. I don't think I can ever trust you again." The room was silent, the weight of my words hanging between us. This was it, the end of everything we'd known, everything we'd been. And yet, in that moment, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if the decision had lifted a burden from my shoulders, even if it left a gaping wound in its place. "What are you saying?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "I'm saying it's over, Jessica," I said, the words sharp and unforgiving. "I'm saying I want a divorce." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, I thought she might break down completely. But she didn't. She just nodded, her face pale and drawn, as if she had expected this all along. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If that's what you want." "It's not what I want," I said, my voice rough. "But it's what I need. I can't live like this anymore." She didn't argue, didn't try to change my mind. She just sat there, looking lost and defeated, and for a moment I almost hated myself for doing this to her. But then I remembered why I was doing it. Because she had betrayed me, because she had shattered our life together, and the anger flared up again, fueling my resolve. "I'll talk to a lawyer," I said, standing up. "We can figure out the details later." She nodded, still not looking at me, her shoulders slumped in defeat. And just like that, it was over. Years of love, of memories, of life together, reduced to a cold, impersonal process that would tear us apart for good. I left the room without another word, heading upstairs to the bedroom that no longer felt like mine. The bed was neatly made, the pillows fluffed, but it felt empty, like everything else in the house. Empty and lifeless. As I lay down, the weight of my decision pressed down on me, suffocating in its finality. But I knew it was the right choice, the only choice. There was no going back from this, no repairing the damage that had been done. And as the darkness closed in around me, I realized that this was the beginning of the end of us, the end of everything we'd once been, and there was no turning back. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, uncomfortable conversations, and emotional exhaustion. Jessica and I moved through it all like ghosts, barely acknowledging each other, each of us lost in our own pain. The house, once filled with warmth and life, felt cold and empty, the echoes of our past happiness mocking us at every turn. I found a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Karen, who quickly took charge of the situation. She guided me through the process with a detached efficiency that I appreciated, even as it made the reality of what was happening all the more stark. Divorce. The word itself felt foreign, unreal, like it belonged to someone else's life, not mine. Jessica hired her own lawyer, and the negotiations began. We had been married long enough that there were no easy decisions, no clean breaks. Everything had to be divided, our assets, our home, even our memories. It was a slow, painful process, each decision another reminder of what we were losing. The nights were the worst. Alone in the bed that had once been ours, I couldn't escape the thoughts that plagued me, the what-ifs, the regrets, the anger and hurt. It all came crashing down in the silence, suffocating me with its intensity. I barely slept, my mind too restless, too full of everything that had happened, everything that was yet to come. I started going to the gym more often, trying to exhaust myself physically to quiet the storm in my head. It worked to a degree, the burn of my muscles, the rhythm of the weights, gave me something else to focus on, something to drown out the thoughts that wouldn't leave me alone. But it was a temporary fix at best. The moment I left, the moment I was alone again, it all came rushing back. Friends reached out, offering their support, their condolences. I appreciated it, but at the same time I couldn't bear to talk about it, to relive the details. So I kept my distance, withdrawing into myself, dealing with the pain in my own way. Jessica moved out about a month after we started the divorce proceedings. She found a small apartment across town, something temporary, until she could figure out what to do next. The day she left, I was at work, by design. I didn't want to be there, didn't want to see her packing up her things, taking pieces of our life together with her. When I got home that evening, the house felt even emptier than before. Her clothes were gone, her shoes no longer by the door. The space where her favorite chair had been was now just a blank spot on the floor. It was like she had never been there at all, like I had imagined the last 2 decades of my life. I wandered through the house, room by room, taking in the changes. It was unsettling, this new emptiness. I had wanted her gone, needed space to heal, but now that she was really gone, it felt like something vital had been ripped away, leaving a gaping wound in its place. I stopped in front of the wedding photo that still hung on the wall, the only reminder of what we had once been. I stared at it for a long time, at the younger versions of ourselves, so full of hope and love, oblivious to the pain that would come. Part of me wanted to take it down, to erase the last trace of our life together. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. Instead, I turned away and went to the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of whiskey. The burn as it went down my throat was a welcome distraction, a brief respite from the thoughts that wouldn't leave me alone. I poured another, and then another, until the edges of the pain began to blur, until I could almost pretend it wasn't there at all. The days turned into weeks, and slowly life began to take on a new rhythm. I went to work, came home, went to the gym, and tried to keep myself busy. The divorce proceedings dragged on. Each new development, another small cut, another reminder of the life I was leaving behind. But I pushed through it, knowing that there was no other way. One evening, a few weeks after Jessica moved out, I found myself back at the river where I had gone the night I found out. It was different now, the water reflecting the lights of the city, the air warm with the promise of summer. I stood there staring out at the water, feeling a strange mix of sadness and acceptance. This was my life now. Different, scarred, but still mine. And as much as it hurt, as much as I wished things could be different, I knew that I had to move forward. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. There was only the future, and whatever it might hold. I took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill my lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of something other than pain. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something close. Something that told me I would be okay, eventually. It would take time, I knew that. The wounds were still fresh, the memories still too painful. But I would heal. I would find a way to rebuild, to create a new life for myself, even if it wasn't the one I had planned. And as I turned to leave, walking away from the river and the past that had brought me here, I knew that I was finally ready to let go. The weeks blended into months, and slowly, the sharp edges of the pain dulled. Life began to feel somewhat normal again, or at least a new version of normal. I settled into a routine, threw myself into work, and focused on rebuilding the pieces of my life that were still intact. But despite my efforts, there was always an emptiness, a void that nothing seemed to fill. One Friday evening, after another grueling week, I decided to head out for dinner. I didn't want to go home just yet, didn't want to face the quiet emptiness of the house. There was a new barbecue place that had opened up a few miles from the office, and it seemed like a good distraction. I wasn't particularly hungry, but the idea of being around people, even if just for a little while, felt like a small comfort. The restaurant was busy, filled with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. It had a casual, friendly vibe, with long wooden tables and a menu scrawled on chalkboards lining the walls. I found a seat at the bar, ordered a beer and a plate of ribs, and tried to relax. As I sipped my drink, I let my mind wander, thinking about anything but the memories that still haunted me. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, or rather, someone, that made my heart skip a beat. There, across the room, standing at a table with a group of people, was Jessica. I froze, my mind racing. It had been months since the divorce was finalized, and we hadn't seen each other since. I knew she still lived in the city, but our paths had never crossed, and I had hoped it would stay that way. Seeing her now so unexpectedly sent a wave of emotions crashing over me. Anger, sadness, confusion, all tangled together in a knot that tightened in my chest. She looked different, happier maybe. Her hair was shorter, and she was laughing at something one of her friends had said, the sound carrying across the room and piercing through the fog in my mind. I'd forgotten how much I loved that laugh, how it used to be a part of my life. Seeing her like this, moving on, living her life without me, felt like a punch to the gut. I considered leaving, slipping out before she noticed me, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe I was just too tired to care. Either way, I stayed, watching her from a distance, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. And then, as if sensing my gaze, she turned and our eyes met. For a moment, Neither of us moved. Time seemed to freeze, and all the noise of the restaurant faded away, leaving just the two of us, locked in that moment. I saw the surprise in her eyes, followed by something else. Was it guilt? Sadness? Regret? It was hard to tell, but whatever it was, it hit me like a tidal wave. Finally, she looked away, turning back to her friends. But the damage was done. The walls I had carefully built around myself over the past few months came crashing down, and all the pain, all the anger, came rushing back in a flood that threatened to drown me. I couldn't stay there. Not with her so close. Not with everything we'd been through hanging in the air like a ghost. I left a 20 on the bar, more than enough to cover my tab, and walked out, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't go far, just to the parking lot, where I leaned against my car, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, and I felt like I was going to be sick. All the progress I thought I'd made, all the healing, felt like a lie in that moment. I wasn't over her. I wasn't even close. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the pavement, trying to pull myself together. But eventually, I heard footsteps behind me, and I knew who it was before I even turned around. Frank. Jessica's voice was soft, tentative, like she wasn't sure if she should be there. Can we talk? I didn't respond at first, didn't trust myself to speak without lashing out. But when I finally looked up at her, all I saw was the woman I had loved for so many years, the woman who had broken my heart, and I couldn't bring myself to push her away. Yeah, I said, my voice rough. I guess we can talk. We stood there in the parking lot, an awkward silence hanging between us, neither of us knowing quite how to begin. The memories of our life together, both good and bad, seemed to swirl around us, making it hard to find the right words. Jessica looked at me with a mix of uncertainty and something that resembled sorrow, and it took everything in me to keep my emotions in check. I didn't expect to see you here, she finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, cautious, as if she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Yeah, me neither, I replied, my tone flat. I wasn't sure what to feel, anger, sadness, or something in between. Seeing her again after all this time had thrown me off balance, and I didn't like it. She took a step closer, and I could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands trembled slightly as she crossed her arms over her chest. How have you been, Frank? Really? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. How was I supposed to sum up the months of pain, confusion, and slow recovery into a few words? But I knew she deserved some kind of response, even if it was just the truth. I've been okay, I guess, I said, choosing my words carefully. It's been tough, but I'm getting through it. She nodded, her expression unreadable. I'm glad to hear that. I've been thinking about you a lot, wondering how you were doing. I know I'm the last person you want to hear that from, but I wanted you to know. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her that thinking about me wasn't enough, that it didn't make up for what she'd done. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the good times, the love we once shared, softened at her words. I've thought about you too, I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. More than I care to admit. The silence between us grew heavier, filled with all the things left unsaid, all the unresolved feelings that still lingered. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she seemed to struggle with her own emotions. It was clear that this wasn't easy for her either, and that realization tugged at something inside me. Frank, she began, but then hesitated, as if unsure of how to continue. I never meant to hurt you. I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to understand that. What happened with Jack, it was a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I'm sorry. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the past. I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept her apology, and let go of the anger that had been festering inside me for so long. But it wasn't that simple. The betrayal had cut too deep, and the wounds were still too fresh. I appreciate that, Jessica, I said, keeping my voice steady. But sorry doesn't fix everything. You broke my trust, and that's not something that can be easily repaired. She looked down, her expression pained. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to say it. I needed you to know that I regret everything. For a moment, I was tempted to tell her that it was okay, that I understood, but I couldn't. It wasn't okay, and I wasn't sure if I would ever truly understand why she had done what she did. The scars were too deep, the pain too real. Instead, I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you, Jessica, but I don't want to carry this anger around anymore. It's exhausting, and it's not who I want to be. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I understand, Frank, and I'm so sorry for everything. We stood there, the weight of our past hanging between us, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward letting go of the bitterness that had consumed me for so long. I think it's best if we go our separate ways, I said finally, my voice firm. We need to move on, both of us. There's no point in holding on to something that's already gone. She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I agree. It's time to let go. With that, we parted ways, leaving behind the ghosts of our past. It wasn't the closure I had imagined, but it was something. And as I walked back to my car, I felt a small, fragile sense of peace begin to settle in my heart. The encounter with Jessica left me shaken, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. For so long, I had been holding on to the pain, the anger, the betrayal. But now, after facing her, after hearing her apology, I felt a shift inside me, a loosening of the grip that those emotions had held over me. The days that followed were different. I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future, about what I wanted from life now that the chapter with Jessica was truly closed. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments when the old wounds ached, but the pain was no longer overwhelming. It was becoming a part of me, something that I could carry without letting it define me. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey in hand, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, I realized that I was ready to start over. Truly start over. The house that had once been filled with memories of Jessica and our life together had become just a house, a place where I lived. And while the thought of selling it and moving on had once seemed impossible, it now felt like the right thing to do. I spent the next few weeks preparing the house for sale, going through old belongings, deciding what to keep and what to let go of. It was a bittersweet process, each item a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. But it also felt like a cleansing, a way to make room for something new. As I worked, I thought about what I wanted in this next chapter of my life. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I wanted to be happy again. I wanted to build a life that was mine, not just a shadow of what had been. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of excitement at the thought of what the future might hold. One day, while I was cleaning out the garage, I came across an old box that I had forgotten about. Inside were photos from our wedding, mementos from the early days of our marriage. I sat down on the concrete floor surrounded by dusty boxes and old memories and flipped through the pictures, a smile tugging at my lips. There we were, younger, full of hope and love, blissfully unaware of the hardships that lay ahead. As I looked at those photos, I didn't feel the sharp sting of loss that I had expected. Instead, I felt a quiet gratitude for the good times we had shared, even if they hadn't lasted. I kept a few of the photos, ones that reminded me of the happiest moments, and put the rest back in the box. Then, with a deep breath, I closed the lid and carried the box out to the curb, setting it down with the other items I had decided to part with. It was time to move forward, to let go of the past and embrace whatever came next. A few weeks later, the house sold. The new owners were a young couple, full of the same hope and excitement that Jessica and I had once shared. As I handed over the keys, I wished them well, genuinely hoping that they would find the happiness that had eluded me. Moving out was a strange mix of sadness and relief. I was leaving behind a place that had once been my whole world, but I was also stepping into something new, something that was entirely mine. I found a small apartment in the city, close to work, with a view of the river. It wasn't much, but it was a fresh start, and that was exactly what I needed. On the first night in my new place, I stood by the window, looking out at the lights reflecting off the water. The city was alive with possibility, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. The past was behind me, and the future, whatever it held, was mine to shape. As I sipped my drink, I thought about everything that had led me to this point. The love, the betrayal, the pain. It was all a part of my story. But it wasn't the end. There was still so much more to come, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face it. I raised my glass to the window, to the city, to the future, and made a silent toast to new beginnings. And as I stood there, watching the world go by, I knew that I was finally, truly ready to move on.